This is a series of conversations on great individuation, the full capacity for human psychological and spiritual development. Murray Stein is a celebrated Jungian psychoanalyst living in Switzerland, and Jim Manganiello is a pioneering depth psychologist and a long-time Dzogchen practitioner living in Boston. In this podcast, Jim and Murray discuss the problem of human egocentricity and the importance of capital S, self-discovery. It is a conversation about what this means for individuals and for groups, and to discover who and what one truly is.
So, Murray, we're just kind of tossing around ideas, see if we can get some perspective, see if there's some vistas or points of view that arise simply out of our discussion. I think that the start is about issues that we've been talking about, which is first and foremost that egocentrism is the central dilemma of the human species. And if we think about the misery embedded in Munch's scream that we've discussed, what Kandinsky calls a materialistic nightmare, at the seat of it, at the core of it, is the dilemma of egocentrism. Would you agree that that crosses all kinds of territories, whether we're talking politics, whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about families, schools, organizations of any kind, that this issue is a very significant
one? Yes. Egocentrism is a natural condition of the human being. And it's been noted by many psychologists and psychoanalysts. You know, Adler's view about the human being seeking a power position because he feels inferior. And so the ego wants to have power and control on a personal level, in relationships and family situations, also control over one's own body, but also on a larger scale, as we've talked about, groups of people want control over their territory, and they want eventually control of the world. I mean, if they get grandiose enough, and in our time, that seems to be the situation of the great powers, the great nations. They want really to become hegemons, as we say, hegemonic, at least of their part of the world, if not of the whole world. And so there's this competition and rivalry of who's going to be the strongest, who's going to be the most powerful and control. And all of that we can refer to what we're calling egocentrism.
Yes, I think that characterizes it nicely in a nutshell. I'd like to add a couple of things to that. Where one feature of the work we're trying to do is establish a deep understanding of the connection between psychology and spirituality. Typically, they've been regarded as two separate realities, when our approach is to see them as interdependent and basically as different realms of mind. So it's very tricky to talk about one without the other, because inevitably what winds up happening is something important is missing from the conversation. So that, for example, if we talk about spirituality, leaving psychology out, the mess that evolves is quite predictable. And the opposite is also true. One of the things that we're referencing is the resolution of binary conflict by a third, the very famous third, that could figure out a way for connection between the apparently opposing forces, connection and resolution of conflict by understanding a third option that does justice to them both, but that carries things on further than each of them could do alone. So one of the, I think, most attractive discoveries, on par with Copernicus's discovery that the sun was the center of the solar system and not the earth, is Dzogchen mind science, which is a contemplative science, which is a very concerted effort to understand the mind, not by studying it with the so-called scientific method, the third-person investigation of the phenomenon of the mind, which sets up a difficult situation. It's like trying to tie your shoes on somebody else's feet. We never get the clarification of the dynamics and forces that are going on in the mind with that kind of science. So the phenomenological science of the contemplative sciences means the direct experience of one's mind. And my view is, with some conviction, but certainly sufficient enough to warrant very compelling investigation, that Dzogchen mind science has discovered the kernel of the issue that we're talking about, which is egocentrism. That, yeah, it appears to come with the territory, but it depends if we understand the territory correctly. So, for example, you and I have talked about a continuum. On one extreme end would be the ego self. In the middle, we could say, would be the self, small s self. And on the extreme opposite direction would be the capital S self. Egocentrism tends to be a given feature of the ego self. Very important to understand. That is the embodied temporal experience of identity, aka the ego self. And upon close inspection, that turns out to be a species dilemma. It turns out to be an embodied dilemma. When the mind is embodied and subject to the operation of the senses, it has a particular problem that comes with the territory of being embodied in time, which it experiences itself and the world dualistically. That is, that the self is in here. And most of us think of the self as the body. The ego self is that frame. I am the body. And the world is out there. Upon close inspection, however, we discover, and I think Jungian psychology in particular has discovered on the temporal side of the fence just how much of a projection that is. That is, the world that we think is out there is more made by our minds than most people could possibly understand at first glance. Does that make sense to you thus far? Are you on board with this?
Yeah, I think there's no question that what we call the world around us is a construction of our mind. And it's a complex construction that comes into being over the course of a lifetime. You know, what we learn, there's this process called introjection. We take into ourselves ideas and images from outside in our learning, in our education, in our families, and we end up constructing a sense of what the world is like. Interestingly, that's coming under severe question nowadays from many directions, namely, do we really know what reality is? I mean, the philosophers for a long time, particularly in the East, have said, what you think is true and real isn't. But that's coming into play now in the West with all these conspiracy theories, and you can't really trust what your doctor says, and you can't trust science, and you can't trust the media, you can't trust the newspapers. What can you trust? What can give you true information? I think it's a good time to raise this question. How do we know what we think we know, and do we know it? And that
Yes,
brings us back then further into do we know ourselves? And that's what you're talking about. If you go
I think definitely.
into the mind, I mean, if you start with the ego, you know what you think you know, your memories, your thoughts. But then if you start questioning those and where they come from, and you continue delving deeper and deeper, you end up in a situation where you have to question your very mental apparatus. And that's a crisis moment. On an individual level, it's certainly a crisis moment on a collective level. If
Yes,
people don't know what is true, what is real, there's panic, there's fear.
right. And in some compelling way, that's good news.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
either the herald of the coming good, or it's the herald of ultimate destruction. And while I think, this has been discussed for eons, the end of the world, this is going to kill us, the telephone, the railroad, we are now at a very dangerous point, particularly with artificial intelligence. And with the current political situation, which is more profoundly dangerous than has been ever before because of the power of the weaponry. But if we just look at this for a moment, you use the word hegemon. I think that's a good word. It's helpful. I think what it basically characterizes is the tendency for us to feel that if we don't get on top, somebody else will.
Yes.
And it's very compelling, I think, being embodied, whether it's a squirrel trying to protect its nuts, whether it's at whatever level. And I think it's a good way of understanding why everything is so insane with respect to political reality, because the power today is associated not with the people with the most creative sensibilities and the most profound ideas, but it's the people who are in control of the people with the greatest amount of weaponry or money, or preferably both. Similarly, with AI, as we begin to flirt with its development, we've got a bunch of technology companies that are just looking to make more money and more money and more money. And their basic fear is that the other companies are going to get there first. They're going to get position. They're going to get ultimate victory position. Now, if we go back, and I've mentioned this to you before, the image, if my cat looks at a mirror, it sees a cat. And there's no way I could talk him out of that. I couldn't give him enough catnip to convince him to relinquish that conviction that what's in the mirror is a cat. And cats have, like all embodied species, have this basic danger. So if you look at the spiritual traditions for a moment, not theoretically, not philosophically, but if you look at what we could characterize as the contemplative sciences, the development of the ego self has been understood rather clearly and rather compellingly. For example, in the Dzogchen mind science, what has been unveiled is that, first of all, that the conviction that we are an identity that is centrally our body, and that we have some kind of an I in us or a me in us, that is taken for granted in the same way that the cat knows, it feels unquestionably that the mirror in the mirror is another cat. We really believe that we're there, that Murray Stein is real, that Jim Manganiello is real. And, you know, if you were to say to me, Jim, you're not real, if I didn't know better at some level, I would say, what are you, crazy? You know, here's my body. Here I am. What do you mean my essence is timeless being? I live in time. I get old, you get old, so on and so forth. So what the Dzogchen mind scientists discovered, and I can't tell you how many times I've mentioned this to people, originally thinking that they were going to fall down and gasp for air because of the enormity of the discovery. Instead, they drive right by it. And they often, oh, I know that. Yeah, I knew that. Sufism taught me that, or Buddhism taught me, Hinduism, Christianity, whatever. My Aunt Sarah taught me that. The discovery is as follows. It's very clear, it's very brief, it's very compelling, and it's the final word on egocentrism, as far as I'm concerned. We have a stream of consciousness. Our thinking mind has a life of its own. Yes, we're capable of directed thinking. I'm now going to open the door. I'm going to pay my bills later today. But at any given moment, we have a river of thought going through us, and we take it for granted. We think it's normal. We think it's the mind. It may be normal in a statistical sense, but upon close inspection, it is the tendency for us to follow that thinking, to like it or dislike it, but in any case, to follow it, which leads to more thinking, which leads to a storyline, which leads to a narrative, which leads to the conviction that we are a protagonist in that storyline. So it's like in a Skinner box where the rat discovers if it presses the bar, it gets the food. And that basic stance of pressing the bar becomes deeply, deeply embedded in that rat's mind. We continue to reinforce the idea that we are an I or a me based on what we impute to ourselves from this stream of consciousness. If we don't follow it, we then are in a position of making the very important distinction between the mind and awareness. Because the mind is simply a fictional dream machine when we begin to follow it discursively. The awareness is who we are. The awareness, ultimately, if deepened, and moves away from the dualistic experience of awareness, which is I and me in the world out there, but where I lose the me and I lose the I, and I just experience the awareness directly, then I actually begin to flirt with the magic of pure being and pure awareness. That's home. That's really home. We call that, you and I, on different occasions, the capital S self, just trying to identify it. Now, if we can experience that awareness as who we truly are, then the egocentric agenda collapses. It begins to dilute, it weakens. It becomes possible to have higher order thoughts that are not separated with this conditioned mind of the protagonist advancing itself, trying to protect itself, trying to get rich, trying to get powerful, trying to get whatever. That we then have the opportunity to say, for example, the politicians might sit at their international meeting and say, hey, why don't we just forget this crap of trying to figure out who should be the most powerful, who should be in control. why don't we begin to consider what's in the best interest of the species and the planet? That can never come from the ego self. That will come from what we're calling the self, small s, that is, the ego self who has woken up to its miscalculation and come to a deeper sense of experience of who it actually is and what life can possibly be.
Beautiful, Jim. Very clear. You're separating the thinker and the thought. When you were speaking, it reminded me of sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night and the thoughts start coming, and as you say, I follow the thoughts, and one thought runs into another thought, and then another thought, and then all these tasks are piling up, and I can't go back to sleep. It's very hard to let those thoughts go, just to let them go, to step back from the river of thoughts and simply be the thinker and not the thoughts, not chase after them or let them take up all the space. It's a very difficult thing. Doesn't that take a lot of training, actually, to be able to do that? And I don't know that world leaders, it would be great if they could go to a camp and learn how to do that. It's very difficult because somehow those thoughts are so demanding and compelling and seductive. It's very hard to step back from them and just let them go and just be the observer and not get identified with what you're observing.
I agree with you. And that's very well said. And I have that similar dilemma. You know, there are nights where, for whatever reason, it's as if this crazy horse shows up, and before I know it, I'm on it, and it's riding me all over the place, and it's very difficult to stop. But you raise a good thing, a good idea, rather. Yes, we can be trained. It can happen through the thinking mind. The thinking mind, when we begin to really deal with remedying the miscalculation of duality, that is not something that the thinking mind can handle at all. It can't conceive of it properly. You know, we have to muster up a critical mass of awareness in order to be able to breathe out and just relax into that experience rather than be taken to West Hell by yet another series of thoughts. So in Dzogchen mind science, for example, the discovery was that part of the task at hand is to develop the capacity not to get swept up by this discursive thought in our stream of consciousness. And that takes some effort, paradoxically, not so much effort. It doesn't have to be heavy lifting, but you need to know how to observe your mind so that you can confirm for yourself, my God, there's a leak in the basement here. I need to fix this. In other words,
aren't there some methods like focus on breathing rather than thought? The breath.
There are methods. A lot of the meditative traditions are methods to quiet the mind, and at some level they can be very valuable because, I don't want to get too far afield, but unfortunately, what this thinking mind can do to us, which you mentioned in the middle of the night, is that we're very vulnerable to the triggering of our autonomic nervous system in the direction of woe, worry, and concern. And that's not just a psychological, mental side of things. That is a release of hormones. Many of us have heard of the fight or flight response. If it were 20,000 years ago and a saber-toothed tiger were to come upon us in Zurich having a cappuccino, we would immediately go into fight or flight, and these hormones would rush into our body, and we would fight like hell, or we would run like hell in order to stay alive. And if we stayed alive, about 2 hours later, those stress hormones would wash out. They would wash out from our system. Unfortunately, today we have what the evolutionary biologists call the great mismatch, which is that our equipment is about 25, 50,000 years out of whack. That is, today, the speed in our way of life, the madness in our way of life, the struggle, the traffic, so on and so forth, triggers this autonomic nervous system unnecessarily, and it tends to, these hormones don't get flushed out of the system. Instead, they seep into tissue and blood. There's a good argument to make that cancer, heart disease can be looked at not only as medical problems, but they're breakdowns of the equipment. The equipment can only take so much wear and tear.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, those hormones also reinforce egocentrism. And if I'm at survival, I don't want to stop and take a look at the beautiful flowers. I need to make sure I get around the corner before you do. But to come back to your precise question, yes, there is a phenomenological science that is incredibly psychological. And this is the interface of spirituality, in that through psychological means, we can relax the grip that duality has upon us. And through this experience of awareness, and it's not awareness like I am now trying to find awareness straining, like I'm trying to lift something heavy, but I'm trying to do what's called in the Dzogchen tradition, non-meditation. And by the way, I really think it would please Dzogchen to no end if we just left Dzogchen at the side of the road. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need, I think it deserves recognition.
Sure. Yeah.
It's the way out of the prison. It's the way out of the destruction of what seems to be going on. Everybody's still ignoring climate change, which is only a taste of, I think, the potential risk in AI down the road. So we get clear, precise instructions of what to do, and we do it. That's it. And it's not a one and done. It's like, and forgive the image, but it's like ballroom dancing. You don't just put your dancing shoes on and jump out there. You have to learn. You have to gradually get a sense of what's, so gradually through training and training and training, and the instructions of how to get to this experience have to be precise and exact, and they have to be understood properly. And ideally, they need to be, we need to have access to some kind of reflection from somebody who knows how to do this. Now, in the Dzogchen tradition, which, as you know, has emanated or arisen from Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan Bon, which is the indigenous spiritual tradition in Tibet. They tend to be, Dzogchen tends to be associated with those traditions, but we're not looking for that. We're not looking to drag a spiritual tradition in by the neck and somehow adopt it. But we're looking at it as a scientific discovery, as a contemplative science discovery. So we're spending time with ourselves, and we're confirming that we have a stream of consciousness. The discursive thoughts are very seductive. They're often filled with memories of historical pain or joy or people who are in the past. And if we follow them, we know what's going to happen. So little by little by little by little, we learn we don't have to follow them. And when we don't follow them, we relax. And when we relax, it's as if you can imagine our thinking mind as a a retort, transparent, large glass, and we've got water in it mixed with tiny particles like very fine sand, and we stir that water up. That's the thinking mind. Now, if you just leave the water alone so that the tiny particles sink to the bottom, all of a sudden the water becomes visible. You can see, it's clear, it's transparent, so on and so forth. So
I like the way you use the image. I think images can help us. I think they can be useful tools. There are also stories. Somebody told me this just recently, a Buddhist story that a farmer was standing in his field and he saw his neighbor coming hell forbid, riding as fast as he could on his horse, and he shouted out to him. He said, "Hey neighbor, where are you going so fast?" And the guy said, the guy on the horse said, "I don't know. You have to ask the horse."
I like that. That's fantastic.
So that's the way the mind operates. It's just going hell bent for leather, and we're on it, and how to get off.
I think it's a brilliant image because we take it a step further, and you're saying, well, let's look at the materialistic nightmare through that lens. And what you see is everybody's gone mad, and they're all going, basically, they're following the horse they're riding on. They don't have any ability to stop it, to control it, and they think it's reasonable and wise. Now, I just wanted to add a little piece. So kind of a preview of coming attractions, potentially, as psychology begins to deepen its vision and it begins to understand the interface between psychology and spirituality. As we begin to bathe more and more in this awareness, we begin to experience something that is quite compelling, which is it's a homecoming of sorts. There's a very deep, heartfelt recognition that, I don't know if when you were a child you played a game, but I often played a game where a bunch of kids would kind of hide something one at a time, and the rest of us would try to find it. And we would get signals, either you're getting colder, you're getting warmer, you're getting colder, you're getting warmer. Somewhere in our hearts, we know something is wrong. At times, we may even feel like we really do belong somewhere else, that our real friends and our real family. Henry Coban talked about this a lot in his images, that we feel so lost and in such a state of disequilibrium. When we begin to connect with this experience of awareness, it's primordial awareness. It's not me being aware of it. It's I am in it. And you can strike the I am out. There's a recognition intuitively that I am not the body. I am the awareness.
Yes.
And there's a glimpse of something much deeper, much more compelling. And by the way, this is an amazing development because we begin to have genuinely creative thoughts from the intuitive mind, from the heart, where, in other words, we're not just thinking, well, I was riding the other day and my horse didn't look as good as my neighbor's horse, and maybe he's feeding something different. Maybe I'll go shopping today. Maybe I'll spend a few hours looking for the right horse food so I can advance my... Instead, we begin to have thoughts of a different character. You and I have often discussed the profundity of the idea of doing to others. And, you've got people never stop talking about it. And ministers and priests and preachers of all kinds and so-called spiritual people never stop talking about it. But nobody can do it. Why? Because the egocentrism is dominant until it isn't, until it's undone. You can have all the best wishes in the world, but we know we get into a state of mind doing to others, and when we lose it, forget about it. When you begin to dissolve and collapse the duality, non-duality, compassion arises naturally. It's part of the territory of who we deeply are. That's the part that's sacred. You know, we have talked about Jesus' famous 6 words, I and the Father are one. And, you know, I think he's probably, you know, in another dimension with an ice pack and a half a quart of tequila over what's been done in his name. The next, you know, the egocentric infection, people building churches, this one's a real Christian, this one isn't a Christian, and this is all religions, so whether we're talking Judaism, Hinduism, but the compelling truth embedded in Jesus's words is, if we understand I am one with the Father, then it's unus mundus, we are one, and the other is none other than me. The other is me, I am the other. There's that sacred vision of the capital S self. We begin to tune that instrument, tune to that, and we begin to have some potential hope for what you and I are calling great individuation.
I'm hearing good music, Jim. I think we have to stop for today, but we will continue. Preview of things to come. Sounds good.
All right, Mari.